Thank you all for coming. I think that's the best introduction I've ever had. Yeah, wonderful. For those of you who don't know it, I was asked to make an announcement that after the evening's events, everyone here is going to be issued a dust rag, and we're to clean up all the glass. I thought I'd start tonight with an autumn poem. It's called Hands in the Wind. Today I drove through a cloud of leaves, pale oak leaves, the color of hands blown over the street, straight toward me out of the empty parking lot of the abandoned Kmart, their fingers swirling about me, feeling all over my car, over it, under it. I don't very often go past there. They must have been waiting a very long time to have been so excited to see me. They had probably blown there from trees in the cemetery just down the block and had gathered to wait, folded over each other, faded old hands with brown liver spots, young hands with a sheen to the skin. Then, when they'd seen my car coming, they'd rushed out into the traffic. It felt as if all the people I've loved were suddenly swirling about me, wanting to touch me, wishing me well. I found myself laughing. It all happened so quickly, and then they were gone. In the rearview mirror, there were only a few leaves still flying, a few fluttering down. They had settled in drifts by the curb, interlacing their fingers. They'd made a mistake. It hadn't been I whom they'd meant to make happy. They thought I was somebody else. Oh, thank you. This new book from Copper Canyon, if it has an emphasis at all, it's about the way we come together in our lives to help one another. I seem to have been writing about this for the last 5 or 6 years, noticing the way people come together and so on. And I'm going to read a few of those poems to begin with here. Two men on an errand. The younger, a balloon of a man in his 60s, with some of the life let out of him, sags on the cheap couch in the car repair shop waiting room, scuffed shoes, white socks, blue trousers, a nondescript gray winter jacket. His face is pale and his balding head nods with some kind of palsy. His fists stand like stones on the tops of his thighs, white boulders, alabaster, and the flesh sinks under the weight of everything those hands have squeezed. The other man is maybe 85, thin and bent over his center, one foot swollen into a foam rubber sandal, the other tight in a hard black shoe. Blue jeans, black jacket with a semi-tractor applique on the back, white hair fine as a cirrus cloud. He leans forward onto a cane with both hands at rest on its handle as if it were a steering wheel. The two sit hip to hip, a bony hip against a fleshy one, talking of car repairs, about the engine not hitting on all the cylinders. It seems the big man drove them here, bringing the old man's car. And now they are waiting. Now they have to wait, or want to wait until the next thing happens, and they can go at it together, the younger man nodding, the older steering with his cane. Thank you. This is the title poem of this book, Splitting an Order. I like to watch an old man cutting a sandwich in half, maybe an ordinary cold roast beef on whole wheat bread, no pickles or onion, keeping his shaky hands steady by placing his forearms firm on the edge of the table and using both hands. the left to hold the sandwich in place, and the right to cut it surely, corner to corner, observing his progress through glasses that moments before he wiped with his napkin, and then to see him lift half onto the extra plate that he asked the server to bring, and then to wait, offering the plate to his wife, while she slowly unrolls her napkin and places her spoon, her knife, and her fork in their proper places, then smooths the starched white napkin over her knees and meets his eyes and holds out both old hands to him. Have some of you seen that? An incident. On the sidewalk in front of the parking garage, a blind man who has fallen is attended by 3 firemen, a medic, and 2 policemen, all of whom squat on their heels and by so doing cover the fallen man with shadows. He sits among them with his legs splayed out, undoubtedly feeling their shadows putting cool hands on his face. And he reaches out a long way through darkness to rest his white fingers on the shoulder of his seeing eye dog, a big, dull-looking black retriever whose tongue is dripping. For this is a warm day in October, the afternoon sun tiny but fierce in the sky. The dog's plain face is bright with uneasy patience, and the blind man's eyes are wide and white, as if a hand had risen up from the darkness inside him and taken his heart in its grip and pulled him down. 2 fire trucks and a squad car idle in the street. People are stopping nearby to see what has happened and what will happen next. Each of us is filled to the throat with some part of the same one fear, as if we had been gathered here to bear it away. And now a few of us turn from the fallen man and walk away and get back into our cars, each of us carrying part of the man's great fear. And it seems that perhaps because of this, he now is feeling better as he gets to his feet in the opening circle and shakes out his arms as if he were suddenly lighter. Swinging from parents. The child walks between her father and mother, holding their hands. She makes the shape of the Y at the end of infancy and lifts her feet the way the Y pulls up its feet and swings like the V in love between an O and an E, who are strong and steady, and as far as she knows, will be there to swing from forever. Sometimes her father, using his free hand, points to something and says its name, the way the arm of the R points into the future at the end of father, or the R at the end of forever. It's that forever the child puts her trust in, lifting her knees, swinging her feet out over the world. I seem to write a lot of poems about blind people. I think it's because I paint and draw, and I've done that all my life, and I'm very tied to the visual world, and the loss of sight seems to me like one of the most terrible things that can happen. At Arby's at noon, I might say about this poem, are you familiar with Arby's? Yeah, okay. My dear friend Jim Harrison is a great gourmand, and he he once published a piece in the New Yorker about a meal that he'd had in France and went on about 3 pages. But Jim hates fast food of all kinds, and I sent him, I exchanged a lot of poems with him, and I sent him at Arby's at noon, and he threw quite a fit that I would be going to Arby's. And so now when I write to him about every other letter, I'll say, well, you know, I was in Arby's the other day, and I tried the Reuben, you know, or something really like that. Jim doesn't come back to Lincoln very much anymore because he got in trouble in the hotel that he liked to stay in. It's a non-smoking hotel, and they caught him smoking in the shower. At Arby's at noon. Some of us were arriving hungry, impatient, while others had eaten and were leaving, bidding goodbye to our friends. And among us stood a pretty young woman, blind, her perfect fingers interwoven about the top of her cane. And she was bending forward, open-eyed, to find the knotted lips of a man whose disfigured face had been assembled out of scars and who was leaving, hurrying off. And though their kiss was brief and askew and awkwardly pursed, we all received it with a kind of wonder and kept it on our lips throughout the afternoon. In a gift shop. Only in recent years have I begun to notice them living among us, and yesterday there were 2 more, the one somewhere in her 70s and in a wheelchair, and the other younger by maybe 20 years, helping the older woman pick out cards from one of those squeaky revolving racks in a shop. The older would gesture with a weak brush of her hand to tell the younger to turn the rack a little, and the younger would turn it, and both would study the cards from the top to the bottom, and once in a while the younger would take a card down and show it to the older, holding it closed and then open, and the older might nod to agree that it seemed the right choice, or she might dismiss it with a shake of her head with its thin white hair. And the younger would patiently put it back. And this went on for what seemed a very long while, as the woman in the wheelchair slowly assembled a little collection of cards in her lap, and the rack turned round as if it were the world itself, though with a plaintive squeak, with the colorful days passing first into the light and then out, and with hundreds of thousands of women like these, each helping another do something for someone not there. If you've all been to Arby's, and you've all seen people splitting a sandwich, here's something else you've all seen. This is called changing drivers. Their nondescript late model car is pulled off on the windy shoulder, its doors flung wide, and the driver gets out, gripping the roof with a hand and lifting himself just as the woman gets out of her side, both of them stiff, both kneading the small of their backs, rolling their heads on their necks, squinting into the midday sun. Then the driver starts out around the front bumper, swinging his legs as if they weren't his thin hair lifting, just as the woman straightens herself and sets out around the trunk, holding her permanent's white curls in place with both hands, both man and woman calling a few words back and forth across the axis of the car's hot roof. As they stoop and fit themselves inside, and the car's springs settle a little, and each of them reaches a long way out to pull the door shut. Her door first, then his. And they rock and shift, fastening their belts. Then both of them lean forward, almost simultaneously, and peer into their side view mirrors to see whatever is bearing down from wherever they've been. And together they ease out over the crunching gravel onto the highway and move on. You know, abstract painters suffer a lot from people going to shows of abstract painting and say, well, you know, I could have done that, you know, that kind of thing. And that's the Changing Drivers poem, I think, is probably one of those poems where people in the audience thinking, well, Jesus, you know, I mean, what's that? I've seen that, you know. I think this poem is sort of at the center of this group of poems that about people helping one another. I teach at the University of Nebraska one class a year, and I park in a parking garage nearby, and this happened on the staircase of that parking garage now a couple of years ago. It's called TWO. On a parking lot staircase, I met two fine-looking men descending, both in slacks and dress shirts, neckties much alike. One of the men in his 60s, the other a good 20 years older, unsteady on his polished shoes. A son and his father I knew from their looks. The son with his right hand on the handrail, the father left hand on the left, and in the middle they were holding hands. And when I neared, they opened the simple gate of their interwoven fingers to let me pass, then reached out for each other and continued on. I've written many poems during my life about houses by the road, abandoned houses. When I was a little kid, one of the poems that really struck me with its mystery was Walter D. Lemare's poem, The Listeners. Some of you know that poem. A rider rides up to a darkened house at night and hammers on the door, and no one comes to the door, and he knocks and knocks again, and no one comes. And then he gets on the horse, and as he's about to gallop off, he turns and says, "Tell them I came," he says, you know, that sort of thing. It's a marvelously mysterious poem, and I have been sort of writing and rewriting it all my life. This is a house in which, a poem about a house in which we don't see the person, the presence of the person there, but we surmise the person. While we were passing, it's called. As if it were waiting for someone, the house faced the road, its door held open by a little bronze dog. The lace curtains at its windows drawn back and tied, so the parlor must have been warm and yellow with a welcoming light. The siding had been freshly painted a sticky-looking white with green screen windows and the customary battleship gray on the floor of the porch, where two plain kitchen chairs were turned to face each other as if prepared for conversation. The grass was recently mowed and clipped by hand around the stones that lined the footpath to the door, and the clippings had been swept away. This happened the last Sunday in May, and on either side of the porch, the peonies were droopy with blossoms. And it looked as if someone had recently picked up the petals that had fallen, though more were falling as we passed, petal by petal, in the indifferent, casual manner of peonies. And perhaps someone was standing just inside and watching them fall, almost feeling them fall, and was waiting for us was waiting to come out again now that we had passed, to pick up more of them, one hand packing them like tissues into the other, keeping an eye on the place where the road came toward her, wide and empty out of the trees. Thank you. I spent, one of my favorite recreations is garage and yard sales, and in the winter, thrift shops. This is a long sequential poem about things at a sale. You can imagine sort of going through and picking up each one of these things like people do at these sales. At a broken window, an old cobweb wadded and rolled by the wind, one of those long woolen stockings your grandmother wore. The parts of a broken bird feeder, put into a box for fixing later, the lid warped on its hinges, its tiny white feathers of paint loose to the touch. One of the sideboards split, but the pieces saved. The board where the bird sat down to eat, now rotted and black from the rains. In the slot where the glass once fit, a few seeds missed by the mice. Some of them sprouted but dead now, the pale wings stiffly folded. An empty coffee can wrapped in aluminum foil. In this poor urn, the peonies rode to the graveyard, covering their faces with immaculate gloves. A baseball with one of its seams split wide, its skin mottled in green, a planet with one of its mountain ranges blown open, displaying a kind of universe, electrons spinning, leaving their vapor trails. The nest of some tiny bird, each blade of dead grass spun into its place on the potter's wheel of her busy movements, preparing a vessel for song. A soggy shoebox, and in its grayness, a yellow tin of corn pads rising, sun-like, over the reflecting pools of a neatly folded pair of glasses. In its tattered paper sleeve, a 78 RPM record, blue label with dog and Victrola, dust sealing the grooves. If we had the means to play it, over the music we'd hear the rhythmical cough of a woman who once bent forward over the turning disc and tried to sing along. Clipped into a sleeve of waxed paper, a lock of hair, tied with a ribbon the color of water, the hair too yellow to have been real, but perhaps when left to itself, like the colors in memories, grown brighter with time. A wind-up wristwatch with a cracked leather band. Throughout his life, a man may, out of curiosity, push his hand up to the wrist through a hole in the fence of time. And then, one day, as he leans there, enjoying the hours, someone comes up on the other side, takes hold, and pulls him through. The red webbed collar for a dog bristled and frayed to a foamy white where it bit back hard at the buckle. A section of unused stovepipe standing unsnapped and open like somebody's coat, and in it the thin blue smoke of a spider web. 5 or 6 feet of heavy black electrical wire gathered up into a few loose coils like a lariat, the last few inches of each end brought over and under the coils, and then very carefully twisted into a tight little pigtail. The tarry insulation drawing back from neat, clean cuts that let the inner wires, white, black, and the bright green ground, push out of the darkness like the first shoots of a lily. Smooth tubes through which the tips of copper petals rise. A 25-amp glass fuse, Under the clear ice of its surface, it is easy to see the silver ribbon of a motionless fish, its body aligned with the current. An envelope of dime store photo mounting corners, little back bats that seem always to wait at the edges. A bucket of white coiled springs from a rotten hammock, each with the tight muscularity of a living thing, drawn back against itself, defensive, every nerve tuned to a snarl. A wooden cheese box with a blue horse impressed on the side, big mare in blinders, head lowered and pulling hard at a wagon of cream cans. A man in a hat with his face in blue shadow up on the seat, reins loose in his hands. The cheese box is easing its seams under the load of a dozen burnt-out spark plugs. Its thin brads loose in their rusty holes. The side slats split. The dead plugs tumble together, muscle to muscle, dark smears of oil on their tight white leather sweaters. Excuse me. On a nail, a chain fish stringer with a few scales stuck to its open hooks. Give it a shake, and it whips and glitters in muscular waves, throwing off light like drops of water. What can be read in the open book of an old brass door hinge? Here are two in a coffee can, one of them coated with cream-colored paint and one brown, the first from a door that once swung into the kitchen and out, fanning the fragrance of pot roast, its paint worried and chipped. The other from the cold brown door to the attic stairs that was rarely opened, behind which stood Winter, wearing an old woolen coat with mothballs loose in his pockets. The first hinge swung smooth on a film of black oil from bacon and chops. The other cried out through the frost. The wooden wheel in this old pulley had nowhere to roll away to, so it stayed right there in its iron harness, whining and whining. A folded wooden clothes horse, its creamy ribs like bone, like a beach umbrella blown inside out by the cold sea wind of time, and next to this, a galvanized tub in which a washboard leans like a staircase up into the present. In a tin can, a pocket of spinach seeds folded over and paper clipped, with a neat hole chewed in the side, and the seeds all eaten but one, a tiny brown leather valise packed with green scarves. A tire that was never used, still wrapped in paper, swaddling, old road maps maybe, soaked and smooth around it like poultices to cool the lust for rolling. A discarded billfold, its breathing shallow, a clam with a brown hinge polished by wear, the halves closed loosely over the flattened pearl of a buffalo nickel. And among these homely things, an antique gilded harp, its dusty strings like a curtain drawn over the silence, stroked by fingers of light. Somebody told me earlier that they liked this poem about an opossum. They have, I say this in the poem, but I want to emphasize it. If you ever looked at a possum closely, they have these very human-like little hands. They're about that big. You were not at all startled to see me when I snapped on a light in the barn and caught you with your curled tail clutching a bundle of pin oak leaves you'd been out collecting for your nest under the floor. In a brain no bigger than a pumpkin seed, there's not much room for fear, and none for self-admiration. So I have pushed aside some of my own fear to admire you. You have soft fur like milkweed down, and bright black eyes alive with all the big and little things you've learned from midnight, using your soft pink nose and your restless pink fingers. It is those fingers that might make a person fear you, for they seem almost human, greedy and dangerous. I think you must know this because you slowly turned toward me and lifted one of your hands to show me how it could grasp and squeeze a tiny piece of the light that fell between us, and even a piece of my breath. Dead bat. I'm particularly attuned to bats because I was bit by a rabid bat about 6 years ago, and I made the mistake of trying to pick up a bat that had fallen into the grass, and it got me in the finger. And there's some kind of interesting things, funny things that went along with this. This was on Labor Day, and I caught the bat in a coffee can, put the lid on it, and knowing that it'd have to be tested. And we went immediately to Lincoln to the emergency room, and they pumped my finger full of gamma globulin and gave me one of the rabies shots right then before they'd even tested the thing. And by this time, we had learned that we were to take the coffee can with the bat to the Seward County Sheriff's Office in Seward County, and that they would process the bat. Well, it's Labor Day, and all the sheriffs and the deputies are off doing whatever they were doing. And I was very tired by then, so my wife, Kathy, took the coffee can to the sheriff's office. And this is such a Nebraska story. It's so perfect. So she rings the buzzer, and the deputy on duty came down to the desk to the window and took down all the information about me and the bat and all that. And she slid the coffee can across the counter to him, and he said, "Do you want the coffee can back?" You never know in Nebraska when you might need a coffee can, you know. I mean, so here's a dead bat poem. When I slid out my heavy thrift store hide-a-bed to sweep around it, then shoved it back, it left behind a bat that must have been shaken out of one of the springs where I imagine it hung for years like a burnt-out bulb. It was frail and almost weightless, as if a boy, the very boy I'd been, had glued it together out of balsa sticks and scraps of papery skin, and I held it up eye level as you would a paper plane and flew it around. Its nasty face with its needle teeth was turned up, ready to snatch whatever it saw out there, banking and darting and weaving ahead in the gloomy afterlife. And after I dropped it with a little rustle into my big black plastic bag of trash, I went back twice to see if it had moved. Don't you hate it when poets do this? Closing the windows. First, the uncertain white fingers of lightning fumbling around with the black hem of the county, peering in under, then thunder, then the flat slap of the first drop on the roof like a fingertip tapping, right here, put the rain here. And then my father, in his summer pajamas, moving in silhouette, closing the windows. No word from him who swept through the house like a flashing shadow. but a chatter of leaves blown over the shingles, the clunk of sash weights deep in the walls, then the storm muffled by spattered glass. It was all so ordinary then to see him at the foot of the bed, closing a squeaky window. But more than 60 years have passed, and now I understand that it was not so ordinary after all. Two more. A person of limited palate. I would love to have lived out my years in a cottage a few blocks from the sea, and to have spent my mornings painting out in the cold, wet rocks, to be known as a local artist, a pleasant old man who paints passably well in a traditional manner. A person of limited palate, earth tones and predictable blues, cloth cap and cardigan, baggy old trousers and comfortable shoes. But none of this shall come to pass, for every day the possibilities go fewer like swallows in autumn. If you should come looking for me, you'll find me here in Nebraska, 30 miles south of the broad Platte River, under the flyway of dreams. And one more. Thank you. This is the last poem in the book, and it's about writing. Right hand. This old hand with which I am writing, holding its pen and pecking its way across the paper like a hen, has pulled me, clucking with little discoveries, across more than 70 years, a sometimes muddy, sometimes frozen barnyard, where, looking back, it seems that every day was rich with interest, both underfoot and just an inch or two ahead of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ted, for that beautiful reading. If you have a question for the poet, please pass it to an usher. We'll get to as many questions as we have time for. Were you a reader and a writer as a child?
Yes. Is this working now?
Not quite yet.
Hello? Hello? Oh, you have to turn it on. Yikes. We're trying to break the glass.
That way we don't have to clean it.
Yeah. Yes, I got interested in writing when I was quite small. Our star poet tonight and I were talking before the event, and I started writing at about the same time she did in third grade. So, and reading, I've always been a reader.
What inspired you to start writing in third grade?
Well, I think all of us were doing that kind of thing when we were little kids, and the teachers had us writing, and I don't remember being particularly inspired by it, but I felt that it was fun, and I think that's what gets people started in poetry is once they discover that it's a pleasurable thing, they'll keep it up. One of the things that's wrong with our educational system, or has been from time to time in the past, is that we've made poetry a problem that had to be solved, and rather than a pleasure. And if you make it a problem, nobody's going to want to do it. So,
when did you find yourself becoming serious about poetry as a career and as art that you wanted to devote your life to?
well, in high school, I didn't have anything else going for me. I had no athletic ability. I couldn't play a musical instrument. I was terrified of giving speeches and debate and that kind of thing. And somehow I got the idea that being a poet and an artist would make me mysterious and attractive. So I took it up. I really threw myself into it, and I dressed like I thought a poet would dress, and tried to look like one. And
Yes. What would that be like?
well, I had a beret, and I walked around with my brow furrowed. I've often wondered if my parents' neighbors didn't think that, well, here comes that poor little Kooser kid again with his forehead all wrinkled up, but that, it was, and by that time I was really hooked. I really loved poetry too. I have to say that seriously, but it was really mostly about girls. Yeah.
Are there any photos of you from this time?
What's that?
Are there any photos of you from this time
I hope not.
that we could look at? When was it that did you come to your focus or subject as a writer immediately, or did it take you some time to come to the style that you eventually came to?
Well, I think most young poets spend a lot of time imitating successful poets, and I did a lot of that with my early work. My first book is really an embarrassment because I can look at it and see the William Carlos Williams poem and the John Crow Ransom poem and so on, but you do it long enough and you have more and more influences, and eventually there's so many influences you can't identify them anymore, and then you become something else, and in later life I've my work is constantly changing. I've become a much more I guess we might say I'm a nicer person as an old man than I was when I was a young person, yeah.
And that's come into your poetry?
Oh yeah, I think so, yeah. I was terribly sick about 16 years ago and got a huge dose of humility at that time, and survived and came out of that, and I think that changed me, really forever. I was never a bad guy ahead of that, but I'm much more in love with life and other people than I was when I was younger. Yeah.
We'll turn to some questions from the audience. How did you meet Jim Harrison?
Jim was working on a novel called Dalva, which is set in Nebraska. It's my favorite of his books. And he was in Lincoln. He would go to the State Historical Society. This is a good lesson for writers. They had a huge photo archive there, and he would sit all afternoon with a shoebox full of old Pioneer photographs and go thumb through them, and just to get the feeling from these things. And I met him at that time. The photo curator at the Historical Society introduced us. This was 30 years ago.
And what happened then?
Well, after that...
You went to Arby's?
After that, we got to... Yeah, we didn't go to Arby's. We just became, we got to the point where we were corresponding more and more and seeing a little bit more of each other, and, became friends over the years, yeah.
Can a person who is not a poet learn how to think metaphorically? And if so, how?
Well, metaphor is really, it's a very complicated associative way of thinking, and I don't think that a person can be taught to think in metaphor, but you can take a metaphor in a given piece of writing by someone and show them how to most effectively use it and how to fine-tune it, and I think you can do that. But I have students who will come to me with a manuscript and they'll show me their poem and they'll say, "Don't you think I ought to put a metaphor right about here, you know?" And it isn't something you go to Radio Shack and buy and just plug in, you know. They come out of some part of the mind, and I know nothing. I'm known for the poems of mine that are metaphorical, but I don't have any idea where they come from. Mm-hmm. It's always a surprise to me when the metaphor comes up and so on. Yeah.
Speaking of teaching, I wonder if you could share a piece or two of wisdom that you would commonly impart to your graduate students.
Well, I make my graduate students read 10 poems every day, day in and day out. I think reading is the best education that any kind of writer can have. We learn how to write from reading other people. And I have also told them from time to time that I think they would be best off reading 100 poems for every one they try to write. The poems that I see that are failures almost always are failures because the person has not read enough poetry. And that's really the key tool to writing, I think. The most important one is reading poem after poem after poem.
I imagine you've read innumerable poems as editor of The American Life in Poetry. What have you learned about America from reading and choosing these poems over the years, and has it changed over the years that you've been reading?
Well, I had the advantage of working for 35 years in something that was not connected with poetry at all. I had a desk job at a life insurance company, and I did my writing in the morning before work all those years. But I worked among people who had no experience or very little experience with poetry. You know, they'd had to read poems in the 8th and 9th grade, that kind of thing. And so I had a secretary. Her name is Joanne Neiman. She at that time was in her early 20s. She had a couple years of business school, and I would bring my poems in the morning and once in a while say, "Take a look at this, Joanne, and see what you think." And if she didn't understand something in it, I would go home and work on it, because that was the kind of audience I wanted. I wanted those people in my audience. I have never been interested in the professional literary English department audience exclusively. I wanted to have a big audience. I wanted to have audiences like this.
Speaking of your work in the insurance business, there's many folks out here tonight, I imagine, who are writers and want to be writers of poetry, but may work in a field that feels far from poetry. What advice might you have for those folks?
Well, the most important part, I think, of any art is suiting up for work, showing up for work, and making time somehow every day to do a little something. I have a friend, Richard Bausch, who is a very successful novelist, writes 200 words a day and then stops. That's it, 200 words and stops. And he's published, 8 or 10 novels and half a dozen books of short stories, and Dick is about 60 years old now. But it's all that piecemeal work, day after day, that accumulates into something. All the time I run into people. I teach some memoir workshops for senior citizens from time to time, and somebody will say, well, I've got a book in me, let me tell you. I've really got this book in me. And then if you ask them if they have written so much as a single sentence, they have not. You know, they want to do this, but they have not gotten started. And you have to start. You have to write a sentence, you have to write a paragraph, and you have to keep going. So,
do you have a spiritual practice?
well, I say a little prayer in the morning when I get up before I write, and it's a little prayer of gratitude for being given another day, and hope that I can use it well. I'm an Episcopalian. I love the liturgy of the church. I'm not in any way a traditional believer, but I love the ornamentation of the church and that kind of thing. I think that probably my closest spiritual activity, well, a couple of them, but writing in the morning early is a meditative thing to do. I am meditating my way into something that I'm going to write. I also am a member of AA, which is a very spiritual thing, and I like being around recovering alcoholics, and I go to a meeting on Sunday morning the hour before I go to church, so I get a double dose of spirituality on Sunday morning. So yeah.
There are a couple questions here about your love of thrifting and junking. So 2 questions. What is the best treasure you've ever found at a thrift store? And what would it be like to attend your own estate sale?
Oh, yeah. The best treasure I ever found was a book at in a store like that. It was one of the 2 volumes that Verena Davis, who was the widow of Jefferson Davis, wrote about. It was a biography that she wrote of Jefferson Davis. She published it in the 1890s in New York. She was living in New York as a widow. And they wanted $15 for it. And I thought, well, this is too much to pay for 1 volume of a 2-volume set. This is before ABE books and Alibris and stuff. You know, the chances of ever getting the other volume were minimal. And I thought, yeah, $15 for 1 volume of a 2-volume biography is not going to work. And but I was thumbing through it, and halfway through it, I found a slip of paper, and I opened it, and it was a personal check that Verena Davis had written as a refund to someone who had bought the book. So I got her autograph inside the book, and I sold the book for $650 with that. Yeah.
How about if we were to attend your own estate sale?
I don't think I have the patience to do that. I have so much junk. I live on a farm. I have buildings and buildings full of books, things I've collected. My barn is full of buckets of bent nails, all ready to be straightened. You know, all that. My widow will have to attend the estate sale. Yeah.
Who were your early favorite poets, and who are some current favorite poets?
Well, early on, I mentioned John Crowe Ransom tonight earlier. I was very interested in John Crowe Ransom's work. Edwin Arlington Robinson, Robert Frost, some of those people. A little later on, I discovered Mae Swenson, who was really a marvelous poet, one of my favorite poets, who could write in any form, in any way. She's marvelously talented. Elizabeth Bishop, Carl Shapiro, who was my teacher at one time, Randall Jarrell. All those people in the sort of mid-years of the 20th century were really important to me. Today, I have lots of poems by individual poets that I'm very fond of. As far as a poet that I turn to for inspiration, Thomas Tranströmer, who is a Swede, has never let me down. He is a marvelous, inventive poet, now in his 80s, much loved in Sweden. When he had a stroke 25 years ago and lost the use of one side of his body, and he had been trained as a classical pianist. And the minute the word got out that Tranströmer had this stroke and lost the use of one arm, composers all over Sweden began composing for one hand, so that he would have things to play. He's a master of metaphor. His metaphors are uncannily beautiful. I quote one of them in my Poetry Home Repair Manual that I've always loved. It's a poem called The Couple. And it's about a couple lying in bed looking up, and they reach up and switch off the overhead light bulb. And Tranströmer says, "The light dissolved like a tablet in a glass of darkness." And it is so perfect that, that's exactly the way that light goes out of that bulb, that dissolving like that, that kind of thing. He's really terrific. I'd recommend him.
Has your own work been translated?
It's been translated into Serbian, interestingly enough, of course, and Chinese, and most recently Swedish, and there's a German translation. The German one I can read. I know a little German, and the translations seem sort of okay. I have no idea what these other ones are like at all, And Spanish, there's a Spanish translation of Delights in Shadow. Excuse me.
We have time for just one or two more questions, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about painting. You mentioned comparing a poem to an abstract painting. Are you a fan of abstract paintings? And who are some of your favorite painters?
I like all kinds of painting. My favorite painting, though, are the paintings that preceded abstract expressionism in the early part of the 20th century. The American Impressionists in that period, and then the moderns like Stuart Davis and Hopper and those people that came along before abstract expressionism. But I like painting of all kinds, and I see contemporary paintings all the time that I love. I was in the Frye Museum today. I assume that everyone here goes there. And that painting by a man by the name of Kester, that's in one of the front rooms, of the molting ducks is an absolutely gorgeous painting, so beautifully painted. I just loved it.
In your current book, there's a sort of prose essay at the end of the book, in which you write about building miniature replicas of houses, both in reality and in your mind. And you've also been painting mini paintings on postcards and mailing them off to friends. What appeals to you about the miniature?
Well, thank you for that. That's a good question. I have always been fascinated by doll houses and miniature things of all kinds, and I think it's because I tend to want to be in control of something, and there's something about having all those things in those little rooms that are sort of inaccessible, but they're in exactly the right position, the way you want them, and nobody's going to mess with them, and I think that's part of it, yeah. I get a catalog from a miniature supply house. It's marvelous reading, I saw the other day something that I'm just dying to have. It's a little plate of deviled eggs about an inch across.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Mr. Kooser.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Please buy books, have books signed over here. Thank you so much.